welcome to Human Ascension with Ellie. I needed one of these today. So I've just popped out. It is stinking hot. It's probably going to take me about 2 hours to drink this because it's the hottest thing I think I've ever had. It's nuclear, but I'm going to give it a shot. It might be tiny sips over the course of this hour. So let me begin today's episode with a question. And I have my question written down to make sure that I've got it right. My question is, what if the book of Revelation in the Bible that predicts the false prophet and the beast are actually real physical things that are about to happen in the world, like for real? But what if they weren't anything like what they've been interpreted by religious scholars to be? So what they are generally agreed to be in the religious realm. What if the beast was an alien race of non-human intelligent beings who have been living under the great oceans and seas of the world for hundreds of years? And they're waiting for their moment to rise from the waters and take over the world. And what if the false prophet was a world leader or a giant, a tech giant or a news forum or a social media forum or influencer or even someone like a ufologist or even perhaps a religion? What if one of those entities was the false prophet? And what if that is the whole principle behind the book of Revelation? Maybe, can we ask ourselves, could it potentially have nothing to do with a fellow called Christ who returns to bring good Christians to live in eternity up in the sky with him in this new Jerusalem? Or what if it's all about aliens and this alien warlord who has designs on the earth and wants to return and harness the human workforce for his or her or it or whatever pronoun it uses for its own benefit? I mean, what if the book of Revelation is all about an alien invasion? Crikey. That would be a big fat surprise. So today we're going to be looking at the merging concept of religion and aliens or extraterrestrials. So first, a clarification to help to explain where I'm coming from. Sometimes people misunderstand me a little bit, and that's okay, but they think that I'm anti-God or anti-faith or anti-religion or something like that. I'm actually not. So one thing that people who are listening or watching might already know about me is that I recently published this book, if you can see, and it's called Tarot Well Done. My book is about my knowledge of tarot, in particular the Rider-Waite Tarot deck, which was illustrated by a woman in London by the name of Pamela Coleman Smith in partnership with a fellow called Arthur Edward Waite. They were both members of the Golden Dawn secret society, and the book is based on all kinds of different philosophies and esoteric practices, including alchemy, astrology, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, the Rosicrucianism, you name it, the whole thing. And I talk about a lot of that in this book. I really love the Rider-Waite deck. There's no surprise there. If you've been watching me even just a little bit on the Ellie Dreams Down Under channel, you'd know that. And I have a lot of respect for the illustrator of the cards. I think that her artistic brilliance to create a deck of cards that represents the journey of life in such a simple yet sophisticated way is pretty amazing. So tarot is all about life's journey. And it uses as its example a fellow by the name of the Fool. And the Fool is the first card in what is called the Major Arcana suite. He's actually numbered 0 because he's the Fool and he has no life experience, and so therefore he can't really have a number yet. He travels through the remaining Major Arcana cards, and as he does, he meets with each of the other cards that teach him lessons about life on the material plane, but also beyond the material plane, going into something more spiritual and etheric in nature. He starts off by discovering that he exists, and he travels to the very first card. He learns that he exists and that he has the power to manifest things in his environment. He then moves on and discovers that other people exist as well. And then he discovers how people are able to live together in a world of abundance and how they're able to harness that abundance for the betterment of their own lives. And then he gets to a card, which is actually the fifth stop in his journey, and it's called the Hierophant. And I'm linking this to my belief about religion and faith and the religions of the world, and how people might believe that I'm actually anti-religion when in fact I'm not. I am very pro Rider-Waite tarot deck and the illustrations by Pamela Coleman Smith and the interpretation of the Fool's Journey through these major arcana cards. And that's the reason why I thought I'd bring this up as the example. I believe in the wisdom of tarot. And basically this fifth stop in the Fool's Journey here at the Hierophant, and I'm going to show you what the Hierophant card looks like for those who aren't really tarot people. That is the illustration of the card in my book, which is exactly the same illustration that appears in the cards that I use. The Hierophant is structured like a preacher or a messenger of God who is preaching to worshippers, to followers. And this card actually represents the necessity for humanity to be able to rely on certain patterns and traditions and structures as part of its existence. So because I believe in the wisdom of tarot, I'm also able to see that that structure, the structure of religion or tradition or things that are continuous or have continuity like faith and belief systems are an important part of life. So whether it's the concept of God or as an omnipresent force, or maybe the Galactic Federation, if that's what you believe in, or Jesus Christ or Muhammad or Metatron or Ra, or whoever it is that you consider to be your guiding force, or whoever and whatever it might be that is the basis of our belief system, I do feel that there is merit in that. But there is another thing that the Fool discovers, and it's a little bit later in his journey. It's nearing the end of his journey when he's actually one stop away from his destination. And that is at travel stop number 18. He lands on one of the major arcana cards, which is called the Moon. Now, I don't have that page open, but let's just see if I can find it really quickly. And I'm very close. There it is, the Moon. So for those who are able to see, that is the Moon card, where you can see a dog and a wolf barking at the moon, which has eclipsed the sun. Well, this is another significant part of his understanding in the Fool's Journey of the way that life works. And the Moon teaches him at that stop one of the most important lessons of all. And that's my point. And that is that life is filled with illusion. There are lots of distractions that actually stop us from seeing the truth. And we all know that that's true. We can feel that there is something other than what we're being presented with in this mainstream traditional kind of existence of reality that is universally accepted to be our reality. We all have different perceptions, however, and different views about what those illusions might be, or what it is that's designed to distract us from the truth. I happen to believe that the way that religion has evolved over time has turned it into one of the biggest illusions of all. It may have started out as something relatively pure and genuine, and of course it was organic, and so it grew and it changed and it evolved. But over the course of time, I believe that it has transformed into something that is not as true as it's being presented to be. I also happen to believe that there's a lot of evidence out there that actually proves that this is the case, that religion as it currently stands is an illusion. It is a concept, and it sits separate from faith or spirituality. So religion is the organization that has been carefully constructed and agreed by certain people to be the truth. And then the rest of us kind of fall into line and believe what we're told to believe. if we're part of that religious group. Those religions that organize themselves, I believe that they have evolved into an illusion. And I believe that it's provable. And I believe that in some ways, this show is an example of just how easy it is to prove that that is the case. So today, just for context, we're talking about the non-human intelligence factor and how it potentially links to this illusion, and whether non-human intelligence is evident in the Bible, particularly when it comes to the book of Revelation and the end times prophecy. So in order to do that, we also first have to take a look at how the Bible began, because the end times prophecy is kind of like the end of the story, and it talks about what happens to humanity eventually. But in order to understand that, we have to also, in a new non-human intelligence or NHI context, we also need to know how the Bible began and how everything originated. So let's look at the first book of the Old Testament first. So the first book in the Old Testament is the book of Genesis. And the book of Genesis is a fascinating book when you start to look at it more closely. It starts with the creation of the world and goes on to cover major events like the stories of Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark and the Tower of Babel and a bunch of patriarchs that become important throughout the Bible and things like that. Genesis lays the foundation for many themes and narratives that continue throughout the rest of the Bible. And it basically sets the tone for the patriarchal system that the world lives in today. So throughout the past 2,000 plus years that we've been aware of the concepts within the Bible, the patriarchal system has set the tone for governments, business, family life, religion, and gender identity, gender roles, privilege, class structure, poverty, crime, wages, justice, education, you name it. It all sits within this banner of the patriarchal system. In recent years, the structure has been challenged like never before, but it continues for the time being to prevail. Genesis, however, appears to be a story of an angry God called Yahweh, who loved the smell of barbecue meat and relished the idea of animal sacrifice. He was cruel and intolerant, egotistical, emotionally unstable. He was greedy, he was very insecure, and he had an extremely fragile ego. He was also very vengeful. All round, he was a really nice guy, you know? And one of the things that this God Yahweh did was he created a really long list of commandments, a really long list. I think around about 613 different commandments appear in the Old Testament. And a person needs to have a photographic memory in order to keep track of all of those commandments. But then God narrowed those commandments down to a list of 10, the 10 most important commandments. And he gave those 10 commandments to a fellow called Moses to share with the world. And as time goes on, I plan to examine each of these 10 commandments in some detail. But today, I want to talk to you about just one of those commandments. And it's the 6th commandment. It's the one that says, thou shalt not kill. Or it could say, thou shalt not murder, depending on which Bible version that you're relying upon. I tend to look at the New King James Bible, but I also look at the original Hebrew text. So from time to time, I'll kind of clarify where needed. But let's just simplify and say, thou shalt not kill. With the discussion of the 10 Commandments, we're now moving into other books in the Old Testament, in particular the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament. And the way that it works is that God, or Yahweh, as he was called in the Bible in the Old Testament, said that it was most important not to kill. So that's one of the 10 commandments. One of the most important commandments is not to kill. But then in the very same breath, God, or Yahweh, wanted us to kill lots of animals as a sacrifice to him, or to stone each other to death if we committed adultery, or to kill one another if there was at least 2 witnesses to any of our crimes. And then God did something so remarkable that it defies logic when you think of those 10 commandments. He decided that in order to forgive us for our sins, he was going to kill his own son, an innocent man that had no reason to die other than so that his father could kill him. He created us in his image so that we would be like him, or aspire to be like him, without his divine power, of course. And then he said, be like me, don't kill, except I'm going to kill to forgive you all for the killing. I mean, WTF, yeah? Okay. I really don't care how much religion might try and spin this little bit of Bible history. It just doesn't make any sense. It's laughable to even think for a moment that it does make some sense. You can't say that one of the most important commandments out there is do not kill. When you kill, to forgive for the killing. It just doesn't make any sense. And the only way that it would make sense is if God, who was the one that handed the commandments over to Moses, and Yahweh, who was the one who did a lot of killing, were two different beings. Or maybe, if they weren't two different beings, maybe God had dementia. That's the only thing that, I can think of as a comparison. But if he didn't have dementia, then it just seems inconceivable that a single God would have all of this conflicting viewpoint. And so I always think of what Judge Judy says. Whenever I'm not sure what to decide, I think of that Judge Judy saying. And Judge Judy says the simplest explanation is probably the truth. And the simplest explanation is that God and Yahweh are two different entities. In fact, they may have been two distinct rivals because they don't seem to agree on very much at all. God is the being of love that hands the 10 commandments to Moses to share with the world. Okay. Never mind that the commandments might have other question marks about them. That's okay. We can cover those in some other time. But God is the loving being or the loving element of the story. But Yahweh is something or someone else, because Yahweh seems to love killing. He loves animal sacrifice. He loves the smell of barbecue meat. He loves torturing people, including children and animals. And he encourages humanity to punish one another by killing one another if any of us dares to step out of line, even just a little bit. But there's also something else to consider, and that is Moses himself, the guy who was given the 10 commandments to share with the world. The books of the Old Testament that talk about Moses and the 10 commandments are, of course, Exodus and Deuteronomy. But there's also another book, a book that the church doesn't like to talk about because it exposes something about the canonized version of the Bible that might actually prove once and for all that God and Yahweh weren't the same entity, and that Jesus was actually in a battle against something else that was corrupting humanity during his time, during the time that Jesus was on earth. We've already talked about some of the Gnostic Gospels on this show, in particular the books of Mary Magdalene and Thomas as well. They are fascinating books, and I'm going to include links to both of those episodes where I talk about the book of Mary and the book of Thomas in the description for today's show. But this book is not one of the Gnostic Gospels, but it is a book about Moses and the 10 Commandments. And it has been shown to physically predate the book of Deuteronomy. So the way that it works is that in 1883, a fellow by the name of Moses Wilhelm Shapira walked into the British Museum in London. Moses Shapira was a Jerusalem antiquities dealer. He was there to talk business with the museum. He presented a series of ancient leather strips onto which the verses from the book of Deuteronomy were written, except the verses were written in a language called Paleo-Hebrew, which is a form of Hebrew that was used about 300 years prior to the date in which Deuteronomy is said to have been written. The reason why we know this is because biblical scholars and ancient language experts have determined that Paleo-Hebrew, which dates back to the 10th century BC, so around 1,000 years prior to the Bible, was replaced by Aramaic by the time Deuteronomy was written. And we also know when Deuteronomy was written because the ritualistic elements that sit within the book of Deuteronomy prove that. The rituals of animal sacrifice and some of the other traditions and rituals and other activities, they fall directly in line with the period during which King Josiah of Judah reigned. But also King Josiah reformed the centralization of worship to Jerusalem during his reign. And Deuteronomy corresponds with that by dating itself and following with the idea of centralization, reform, doctrine that was actually enacted by King Josiah. And what was really strange about the version of Deuteronomy that Moses Shapira brought into the British Museum in 1888 was that it was a word-for-word identical copy of Deuteronomy, except with bits missing. And when I say missing, I mean the verses ran concurrently as they do in the Bible. There were no gaps anywhere, but in some cases, the verses that existed in Deuteronomy, in the Bible, in the canonized text, didn't appear in the text that had been created earlier. When the museum's biblical writing experts examined both versions of Deuteronomy and the Moses Shapira version of Deuteronomy side by side, what they discovered is, on one hand, the leather version that was brought in by the dealer was in an older language, and the new language version, which is classic Hebrew, was what appeared in Deuteronomy has been canonized. And that's because the Paleo-Hebrew had been replaced with Aramaic, and the classic Hebrew had been adopted by some of the writings in the Bible. Well, that version appeared to have extra verses. The canonized version had extra verses, and the extra verses were, without exception, all about things like animal sacrifice and other rituals and centralized worship in Jerusalem, which had been created by the king, King Josiah, and the need to follow the advice of priests as well. None of those things, none of the talk about animal sacrifice and centralized worship and the need to follow the advice of priests appeared in the earlier leather scripture that had been brought in by the antiquities dealer, Moses Shapira. None. It's kind of like in the Bible, they were inserted later. So here are some examples, because of course I want you to have some examples. We're looking at the Bible. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 6 through 7, it says, "There you are to bring your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your special gifts, what you have vowed to give, and your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. There, in the respect of the Lord your God, you and your families shall eat and shall rejoice in everything. And you have put your hand to, because the Lord your God has blessed you." So basically, these verses say that God will bless the people who kill other living beings for the purpose of making offers of sacrifice. So here's another example. In Deuteronomy 12:11, it says, "Them to the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name. There you are to bring everything I command you, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your special gifts, and all the choice possessions you have vowed to the Lord." This dwelling of God's choosing, which for his name, in which the people must bring their sacrifices, was decided by King Josiah to be Jerusalem. In fact, there was so much animal sacrifice taking place in Jerusalem at one point that they had to build a kind of a ravine, and I'm sorry, this is quite disgusting. They had to build a kind of a ravine in order to catch all of the blood that was flowing at the time, which makes me feel a bit ill even now, thousands of years later, even having to describe it. Apparently, at certain times of the year, the Israelites would sacrifice as many as 250,000 animals in a single day. So remember that sixth commandment, and they were doing it to make God happy. Remember the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. It doesn't say anything about thou shalt not kill unless it's to sacrifice animals. It just says thou shalt not kill. And here's another one about the priests. In Deuteronomy 17:9 through 12, it says, go to the priests who are Levites and to the judge who is in office at that time. Inquire of them and they will give you the verdict. You must act according to the decisions they give you at the place the Lord will choose. Be careful to do everything they instruct you to do. Act according to what they teach you and the decisions they give you. Do not turn aside from what they tell you to the right or to the left. Anyone who shows contempt for the judge or for the priest who stands ministering there to your Lord, your God, is to be put to death. You must purge the evil from Israel. So basically, thou shalt not kill, but thou shalt certainly listen to priests, and if thou doesn't listen to priests very carefully and do exactly as the priests say, the priests and the judges, who are also people and subject to the sixth commandment, can break the commandment just a little bit and put thou to death, basically. And so thou shalt not kill unless thou feels a desire to kill, and then thou shalt certainly kill and be blessed for it. Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to be fair here because obviously the world, because obviously the words murder and kill are different. And Deuteronomy includes other verses that talk about what to do with people who murder one another, because murder is something other than killing. You know, if you are walking down the street and you step on an ant, then you've killed the ant. But you didn't murder the ant because you didn't make a decision and plan and lay in wait with a machine gun to murder, or even without a machine gun, to murder the ant. You just happened to kill the ant because of your ordinary course of business. And so I wanted to make sure that I understood what the actual translation was in the original Hebrew text. So I did a word-for-word translation of the sixth commandment as it appears in the canonized Bible, and compared it to the original Hebrew text. And it was as easy as anything because the original text only consists of two words. The first word is lo, and that means you will not. And the second word is tertzek, and that word means kill. So actually the original wording of the sixth commandment is you will not kill. You will not kill. The later translation, however, splits hairs by adding bits about murder. So it's saying you can kill, you just can't murder, because they are, of course, two different things. The accurate translation would be simply do not kill. And so why is it that the priests and the judges are being blessed for murdering people who don't listen to them? It just doesn't make any sense. But this is the reason why I'm mentioning it. Because guess what? Those bits about murder, they don't appear in the earlier version of Deuteronomy that Moses Shapira took to the British Museum. It was added later to the canonized version. And just like all the other bits of the Bible that seem weird and nonsensical, this bit helps us to contemplate what might have really been going on at that time when Deuteronomy was being written. The verse in question appears in Deuteronomy book 6, verses 4 through 9. This section is referred to as the Shema. The canonized version of the text says in the following sentence, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." But the earlier version that was brought to the museum in 1883 says, "Hear," slightly different spelling, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one of the gods." Now, the canonized version of the text may or may not say the Lord our God, the Lord is one, or it might say in some versions of the Bible, the Lord our God is the only God. But that's not what the original text says. The original text says the Lord is one of the gods. One of the gods. And the reason why we know this is because of the word that was used to describe God or gods. The word God was different in the earlier version that was brought to the library. It had a different name for the word God. In the canonized version, the word Yahweh appears 190 times to describe God. And on 38 other occasions, it uses the word Elohim to describe God. But Elohim is a plural word, and it can only refer to multiple entities, so multiple gods. And it will appear as things like us and we and that kind of thing. Well, that's all Elohim. In the earlier version of Deuteronomy, which was the one presented by the museum, almost every reference to God chose the word Elohim. But the later version that was canonized had changed the word Elohim in almost all instances to Yahweh. So what the earlier version of Deuteronomy tells us is that there were more than one God, or more than one God-like entity, more than one entity that was interpreted to be a god, and that the various different gods were in a battle, apparently, a battle of principles about whether there should be killing or not. And collectively, all of those gods, regardless of whether they were pro or anti-killing, they were all part of a family of gods called Elohim. Or Elohim was the name of the fact that it was like saying all those gods. It could be something like that. But one of those gods was called Yahweh, and he was a nasty piece of work. And on the other side was a God that was trying to limit the people's list of responsibilities to just a single real responsibility, and that was that of love. Because if you love, you can't kill. There's only one rule, which is only one truth, which is just one light, which is basically love. And that's all that there is. And everything else is a lie. Well, that's what Jesus was also preaching throughout the New Testament. But when you put the Bible together, it's convoluted and it keeps contradicting itself. And that's because it's giving credit to someone like Yahweh, who had an entirely opposite viewpoint. And so a bunch of aliens appear to be discussed in Deuteronomy. They were pretty powerful, they were present at the time, and the top alien was called Yahweh. And Yahweh couldn't work within the parameters of this love business, right? Because he was an egotistical guy with a big chip on his shoulder. So he appears to have recruited a bunch of humans. He called them priests, or he called them judges, and he changed the rules. And he probably did that through brute force, to be honest. I'm not saying that those early priests may have volunteered or they may have been forced. But he changed the rules and he put them in charge because, even one nasty alien can't do it all by himself. And that's what we're seeing discussed in the Bible. The funny thing is, if that's the story, then suddenly it begins to make sense. Now, I do have to add a little something, and that is that Moses Shapiro, the antiquities dealer from 1888, he actually ended up committing suicide shortly after he visited the museum. At least that is the official story. It was around 9 months after he'd presented the scrolls, the leather scrolls, to the museum, and there was an investigation and examination of the scrolls that was done. Some of the examiners proclaimed that the scrolls were a forgery. Others proclaimed that the scrolls were authentic. It caused a massive controversy at the time, and the official story after is that Moses Shapiro committed suicide to escape the shame that his life had become, basically. A little bit like the really good ET whistleblowers and investigators ultimately seem to also commit suicide shortly after they have provided some kind of disclosure about what they know. It's a bit of an epidemic, really. My favorite ET-related suicide, to be honest, was when the physicist and ufologist James E. McDonald left hospital the day after he shot himself in the head. He was blind and alone, but somehow he got himself out of the hospital bed and he went down to a riverbank a few miles away. He managed to get hold of another gun somewhere at the hospital, maybe in the vending machine or something at the hospital, and he managed to shoot himself dead twice, just to make sure that he didn't miss the first time. This is an actual thing that I've done a two-part series on. I was doing a series of episodes on the Ellie Dreams and Under channel called Cold Case Tarot, where I would look at cold cases and have the cards kind of see if we can interpret what the case may have actually been. And I provide a detailed backstory and then I do a reading on it. And I did a two-part series. The first part was related to a UFO phenomena that took place in Australia, not far from where I lived actually, in 1966. And James E. McDonald had been in Australia shortly after that UFO phenomenon. It was a big one where about 100 students and teachers saw, it was at the Westall High School, and they saw a series of disc-shaped UFOs. One of them landed in a field behind the school, and then one of the witnesses disappeared. Her whole family disappeared, and the US military showed up and everything. This all happened in 1966, and it was a big deal. And I did an episode on that to find out more about that. And then people asked me about the investigator, who was James E. McDonald, who had been involved in looking at this phenomenon. And I did a cold case reading on him as well, to find out about his death and what actually happened to him, what the truth was. And if you're interested in the tarot perspective, or even just the backstories, because the beginning of each video generally has a detailed backstory, I'll include links to those videos in the description for today's show as well. So basically that's our backstory for today's episode. So let's have a look at the Book of Revelation. Okay, I'm going to focus on two aspects of the Book of Revelation, as I mentioned at the top of the show. And those are the bits relating to the beast, which is generally considered by Christians to be one of the names for the Antichrist. And I'm also going to be looking at bits related to the false prophet, who is an entity that helps to turn the beast into a symbol of worship. Just before the return of Jesus, when Jesus comes and saves everyone and the whole thing ends with eternal life in heaven. So first, let's have a look at the beast. So the beast is a symbol of power and control. It is described as rising out of the sea. It has 7 heads and 7 horns and 7 crowns on its horns. In a religious sense, this is understood to mean that across the 7 nations of the world, or maybe 7 regimes over time, 10 leaders or rulers are going to help to shape the world in which an antichrist human being can rule over humanity. In a non-human intelligence sense, or ET sense, the beast might very well be in a moment in time when non-human entities or ETs have been living in the oceans of the world, which many people believe is actually the case. And they decide to rise out of the water and rule over the world. And because they're beasts, they're kind of unusual looking. And that there will be 7 nations and 10 influential leaders who will either succumb to the power of these beastly entities, or who might agree through transactional relationship to make whatever it is they want happen. In all honesty, it makes more sense, remember Judge Judy, it makes more sense that a non-human creature or society of creatures, particularly if they're an advanced species, would be able to persuade leaders of the world to succumb to their will. I just can't imagine in a world of 8 billion people that a single man, regardless of, this whole concept of a single man being some world leader who would take over the world without there being some kind of alien force behind him. I just don't think he would ever be powerful enough to overthrow an entire world of authoritarian leaders, because, the world does have a lot of authoritarian leaders, and they don't bow down to anyone. They don't. They're not going to succumb to some other world leader. That's the whole point of them being authoritarian. But they might bow down to a bunch of aliens, because that is a whole other box of matches, you know? According to the book of Revelation, the only people who don't end up worshipping the Antichrist or the beast are the ones who are written into the book of life. So the book of life is a list created by God of people who have faith in God and live righteous lives. They are believers in Jesus Christ and have accepted him as their Savior and Lord, and they have overcome sin and remain faithful to God's commandments, including the sixth commandment. The most relevant verses of that fact appear in the New Testament in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 to 22. And this is what it says. It's a direct quote. And this is actually a direct quote from Jesus. Okay. So I'm reading from the New King James Bible, and it says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment.' But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, 'Raca,' shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be in danger of hellfire." So in this passage, Jesus is explaining the sixth commandment. He says that committing murder is not the only way to break the commandment. Anger and insult can also break the commandment, and he highlights the importance of reconciliation and harmony among individuals. So in order to be in the book of life and exempt from the Antichrist or from the beast, you need to have adhered to Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 to 22, which basically isn't possible. It's impossible not to get angry, because anger is an emotion that is instinctive. We may not express our anger, but we feel our anger in the same way that we feel hungry or tired or cold. And I have always suspected that the book of life is a human construct, just a way to make certain people feel as though they're listed somewhere, like, you know, they're in the club, to help keep people in line. Because the beast specifically comes out of the sea in the book of Revelation, this is far more likely to be an organic entity of some kind, so probably a non-human form of intelligence. And, you know, I say it all the time, the Bible sounds like a story about aliens. It does. And it's about humanity. It's about humanity and it's about life. But I think that it's also about aliens, and the aliens that either put us here or found us here and ruled over us for some time. So let's move on to the false prophet. The false prophet is, as described in the book of Revelation, is really about the concept of modern influence and deception. The way that it goes is that another beast rises, but this time it rises from the earth. And what that indicates is that the second beast, the false prophet, is already on earth. So perhaps they are human. So the false prophet might be a trusted voice, someone with influence. Maybe they're a world leader or a celebrity or a religious figure of some kind, or some other kind of person with a vast amount of influence. They might even be an influential forum, like a social media forum or a news network or a particular religion or set of belief systems, or a social media influencer or something like that. Something or someone with influence who can convince others what to believe. It could even be a tech giant, for example, because the most notable aspect of the false prophet is the mark of the beast. And the mark of the beast relates to a mark that is explained to be compulsory in the book of Revelation, and it's placed either on the forehead or on the right hand. It becomes the only way to trade money and goods, so people can't survive in a material world without the mark of the beast. It sounds like something technological. And that is likely to either come from the tech giants or an advanced species, such as a non-human sentient being. And the whole point of the mark of the beast is to control people in the way that they understand. So what this actually could be about is it could be about the Antichrist beast rising out of the sea, partnering up with a technological beast, which is the false prophet. And that's how they control the people, because they control the people with the survival mechanism, which is that of money and trade. Because people understand that we can't survive on earth without material stuff, because that's what the world is. That's what the world is made of, and it's required. We need food, we need shelter, we need medicine to survive. So if we can be controlled, we can be controlled very easily if our only access to food and shelter and medicine comes with the inclusion of something on our forehead or our hand, and that's the only way we're able to access it. I'm kind of reminded a little bit of the Hopi prophecy of Native Americans, in which Great Spirit returns with an army of red-capped or red-cloaked beings, and there is nowhere to hide because everyone can be found and identified for who they are. And so that makes me wonder also whether something like DNA might be relevant, a DNA registry or a microchip or a barcode or something like that. Once again, when you look at the book of Revelation, things like the beast from the sea and the false prophet from the earth, they make much more sense if you place them into the context of a non-human intelligent species than they do if you simply consider them to be a person who becomes powerful enough to oppose Christ and rule the earth for 1,000 years. I'm not even sure that anyone on earth could be powerful enough to even oppose the other leaders of the world, not in their entirety. I just can't imagine Vladimir Putin, Viktor Orban, Kim Jong-un and President Xi bowing down collectively to some other human world leader. I just don't think it's possible. But they would bow down to an alien presence because, like I said, that's a whole other box of matches. The whole Bible, as I say repeatedly on this show, whether you're talking about the Old Testament or the New Testament, it appears to be a collection of contradictory nonsense. Like, thou shalt not kill unless you decide to kill. So I'm just going to kill my son to show you that you're forgiven for all the killing that you've done. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, especially when Jesus says don't kill. And don't use anger or hatred as weapons because they're the same as killing. And that was the reason why I brought up that passage from, where were we? I think it was Matthew, where Jesus akined together that killing and anger and hatred are all very much the same because they're the opposite of love. And love is what he wants everyone to aspire towards, not killing. There are 4 particular verses in the Bible in which Jesus expressly states that he does not condone the sacrificial offerings to God that were taking place in the Old Testament. He is very explicit about what he says. So this is what he says. Here are the passages. In Matthew 9:13, it says, "But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." And then in Matthew 12:7 it says, "But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless." And then in Mark 12:33 he says, "And to love him with all the heart, with all the understanding, with all the soul, and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself, is more than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices." This is very clear. Jesus is saying that the actual God, not the Yahweh one who liked barbecue meat, the actual God isn't impressed by ritual sacrifice. He is impressed by love. And then finally in John chapter 2, verses 14 through 16, it says, "And he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers doing business. When he had made a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold doves, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." In this passage, which is 100% impossible to misinterpret, Jesus is telling people that he and God are offended by the idea that God's temple, where 250,000 animals were being slaughtered sometimes on a single day, enough for there to be a ravine built to capture the blood, that this was all being done. He was offended that this was being done in God's name. And worse yet, that the priests were profiting from it. So remember that the canonized version of the Bible says that you have to give the best bit of your animal sacrifices to the priests. And remember what the book of Thomas says when he says that the priests are lying to us. And remember that it was the angry God, the Yahweh God, who recruited the priests. Jesus was very clear. God wants humanity to express inner righteousness, not demonstrations of ritual. He doesn't give a flying four-letter word about pomp and ceremony. All the traditions like circumcision and bowing to the east and the west and attending Sunday services or avoiding certain foods or certain words or banning certain things like books or clothing or whatever, or forcing certain things onto other people, or arguing for the sake of being right in your opinion, or dressing a certain way, none of that impresses God. The only thing that impresses God is the inner light of love that each person already has inside them. And so now we're narrowing things down. The Gospel of Mary says that the inner light of love and truth is the only thing that's real. Everything else is a lie. The Gospel of Thomas says that the church of his time was lying to us and that the real truth is being hidden. And the leather scrolls that Moses Shapira took to the British Museum in 1883, which are known as the Shapira Scrolls, and sometimes they're even called the Moses Scrolls, contain a version of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament that predates the actual Bible. And it does not contain any references to centralizing worship to Jerusalem or taking guidance from priests or sacrificing animals to impress God. And we mustn't forget that everything this Yahweh guy in the Old Testament wanted humanity to do related to them impressing him, and it was generally in complete opposition to what Jesus has been expecting of humanity in the New Testament. And of course, there is another little thing to add as a sort of a side note, and that is that what was kind of peculiar about the death of Jesus on the cross, which was done in a particularly cruel way, was that it happened shortly after Jesus started telling people not to do the very things that Yahweh had been telling them to do. He told the people to cut off the supply of barbecue meat, and within a few days he was hung from the cross. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying this last bit, but there is a possibility that God didn't kill Jesus. Maybe that was simply a hit job by humans because Jesus was becoming influential and they wanted to get rid of him. And then they just decided later on to explain it away like he was a ritual sacrifice, which proves that God loves ritual sacrifices. You see? And that's not the topic of today's discussion. Jesus' death is a topic for perhaps another day. And I'll go into that maybe sometime in the future. But as soon as you begin to think of it in an extraterrestrial way, within the concepts of non-human intelligence, it starts to make perfect sense. Though that Yahweh is not the same as the God that we understand to be a loving God. Yahweh was another entity that was in direct contradiction or in direct competition with the principles and the entity and the proponent for love, which turned out in the New Testament to be Jesus. And Yahweh wanted death. Yahweh wanted sacrifice. He wanted to smell that glorious barbecue meat. And Jesus, on behalf of God perhaps, but just Jesus, wanted all of that to stop. And he wanted love. And if he was working on behalf of God, God was the one who gave Moses the commandments, the sixth of which said, do not kill. You will not kill. So why is it that Yahweh wanted so much killing? It just sounds like they're different people. And as soon as Jesus started getting in the way of this tradition of ritual and sacrifice in which the priests of the early day had somehow been forced or cajoled or threatened or transacted into becoming a spokespeople for Yahweh and profiting with the best cuts of animal sacrifice and also other types of wealth, that, a certain percentage of wealth was always given to the priests and things like that. Perhaps Jesus was a threat to the priests. What that does is it sets this entirely different perspective where God was just one of the gods, that there were many and they were competing and battling against each other. That the Gospel of Mary talks about how the truth is inside you and that everything else is a distraction. That the book of Thomas says that the church is not on our side. The church is trying to distract us from what's real. And that these leather scrolls that appear in the Shapira scrolls that were handed to the British Museum talk about how the Bible was constructed with all of these ritualistic things added later to kind of make it look as though they're necessary. And when Jesus was murdered, he was made to look like a sacrifice to validate all of the other sacrifices. That's what it's starting to look like. In order to really understand the Bible as something that is a document that makes sense, you need to recognize or be open to the fact that something non-earthly was present at the time. And so you know what this means? It means I'm going to have to go out and start buying some of those books from Paul Wallace. Paul Wallace, and I'm going to just catch up on my reading because apparently Paul Wallace and I have reached very much the same conclusion. We just did it separately. Paul Wallace is living over here in Australia. I don't know where he's from originally, but he's written a series of books related to the topic of the Garden of Eden. I think they're the Eden series. He talks about how the Bible is actually a book about aliens. And I think I agree with him. We may have come to the same conclusion separately. I did my own research, and ever since I started talking about the concept of aliens appearing in the Bible, people have messaged me and said I need to go out and read Paul Wallace's books. Okay, I will. I actually am going to go and see if I can download a book on Audible and listen to it while I'm doing my stuff. But I'm definitely going to have to catch up and hear what he has to say, because we do appear to have independently reached very much the same conclusion. I believe that hundreds of thousands of years ago, something happened on Earth that involved humans and angelic beings, perhaps, and aliens. Many people witnessed and wrote about those events. The events were then distorted. They were split into acceptable and not acceptable documents for history. So some of them ended up being hidden in caves or, waiting to be discovered, or they were destroyed, and others were canonized. Some of them were, the canonized ones were probably used as methods of controlling the people. And some of these documents were also rewritten and modified for the personal gain of the greedy. And one episode at a time, I'm hoping to figure all of this out. And I do hope that you will join me in my journey. My name is Ellie, and you can find me at Ellie Dreams and Under on YouTube. Don't forget to check out my new book, Tarot Well Done, to find the best price for your country and the various delivery options. You can go to bookfinder.com and put in your destination and your currency. It's constantly being updated because obviously Tarot Well Done is a new publication, and as new bookshops and online sellers and libraries pick up the title, then they will be advertising it, and Bookfinder will find them. I'm also hoping to have copies available on the Ellie Dreams Down Under channel at the Ellie store, particularly for Australian and New Zealand readers. And every now and then I might even be offering some signed copies as well that will be posted by me directly. So do look out for that. Thank you for everyone who is listening today on one of KGRA's broadcasting platforms to become a member of the KGRA viewership family and listen to your choice of hosts and shows in the company and chat community with like-minded watchers, spiritualists, experiencers and weirdos like me, then just go to live.kgradibby.com and put in promo code Ellie to get 30% off your subscription. So that's it for today. It's been a pleasure. Until next time.